A stranger collapsed in her barn, bleeding and half dead, whispering her name though they'd never met. Maggie Lane could have turned him away, alone on the Kansas plains with two young children and no one coming to save them. But instead she chose mercy. That single act sparked a legacy that would echo through generations. A story of wounds mended, hearts rebuilt, and a love so deep it turned a dying man into a father, a protector, and the soul of a family that would change countless lives forever. This is where survival became something more. The storm rolled in fast, angry black clouds stampeding across the Kansas plains like something hunted. Maggie Lane had just finished covering the last row of tomatoes when the wind picked up, sharp and sudden. Dust kicked up from the earth, dry as powder. The hens screamed from the coop. She looked toward the horizon and saw the sky split with lightning. Another storm, another night of prayers whispered into the dark. She ran to the porch, hair whipping around her face, calling to the children, "Inside now!" Ellie came first, arms full of kindling, her face flushed from the heat, 8 years old and already carrying herself like someone twice her size. She ducked inside without a word. Caleb followed, barefoot, holding the tin pail of feed for the goats. Only 6, but he'd learned how to check latches and sweep the barn clean without being told. Maggie shut the door behind them and dropped the latch. The house rattled in the wind. One of the shutters banged open, and she rushed to fix it, pressing her weight against the frame until the hook caught. Rain hit like gravel, fast and loud. She sank into the chair by the stove, pressing a hand to her chest. The storm outside was loud, but the silence inside was louder. No husband, no father, no neighbors within 5 miles willing to lift more than a hat brim in greeting. Maggie had learned early that no one was coming to save her, so she saved herself. Day after day, one fence post, one bread loaf, one sleepless night at a time. The children settled near the fire. Ellie opened the worn copy of Robinson Crusoe they read together every week. Caleb leaned against her shoulder, thumb in his mouth, pretending he didn't need comfort. Maggie watched them, her heart swelling with both pride and sorrow. They were good kids, brave kids, but they shouldn't have had to be. Outside, the wind screamed. Then, beneath it, something else. A sound she didn't recognize. A crash. Maggie stood slowly, her heart thudding. She reached for the old shotgun above the mantel and checked the shells. It wasn't loaded. She kept it empty now. Just the sight of it had been enough the last time someone came asking questions about her husband's debts. She pulled on her coat, grabbed the lantern, and stepped out into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her sideways. She held the lantern close, shielding the flame as she made her way to the barn. The animals were restless. The horses whinnied, the goats bleated, and the chickens thrashed in their roosts. Then she saw it. The side door of the barn hung open, swinging wildly in the wind. She stepped inside, boots sinking into the straw, heart pounding. Something moved near the far stall. She raised the lantern and saw him. A man slumped in the corner, half covered in blood and mud, his face shadowed under a battered hat. His coat was torn. One boot was missing. He clutched his side, and even from across the barn she could see the way his breath came hard and fast, like every inhale was a battle. He looked up. Their eyes met. Then he passed out cold. Maggie didn't move for a full minute. Then she lowered the lantern and crossed the barn. She knelt beside him, pressing her fingers to his neck. Pulse, weak but steady. He was burning up. Fever, blood loss, infection. She should go back to the house, tell the children to stay put, lock the doors. But something in her wouldn't let her leave him. Not yet. She slid her arms under his shoulders and heaved. He didn't weigh much, bones and muscle but no fat. She half-dragged, half-carried him to the empty stall where they used to keep the old mule before it died last winter. She shoved aside the hay and laid him on the bed of straw. His breath hitched, his lips moved. "Maggie!" Her heart stopped. "How do you know my name?" she whispered. But he didn't answer. He was unconscious again. She lit the oil stove in the corner and hung the kettle. Then she ran back to the house. Ellie was waiting, arms crossed. "What happened?" "I need towels," Maggie said. "Boil water. Bring the big scissors." "Is someone hurt?" "Yes." "Who?" "I don't know." Ellie didn't ask anything else. She just moved, efficient and silent, grabbing what was needed while Maggie loaded the old tin basin with the last of their well water and ran back to the barn. He hadn't moved. She set to work, cutting away his coat and shirt. His chest was covered in bruises. There was a deep gash near his ribs, crusted with blood. She cleaned it the best she could, trying not to think about how much gauze she had left. Not much. Her herb stores were low, too. The fever would be the real danger. He stirred when she stitched the wound, groaned softly. She whispered apologies, not sure why. "Almost done," she told him. "Hold on." By the time Ellie arrived with the rest, the bleeding had stopped. Caleb peered around her legs. "Who is he?" "I don't know," Maggie said again, "but he needs help." They sat with him all night. The storm passed just before dawn. The man didn't wake. When morning came, Maggie checked the wound again. Still closed. The fever was climbing, though. She crushed the last of her willow bark and made a tea. He drank it without waking. Ellie helped. Caleb brought water. No one complained. 3 days passed. On the 4th, he opened his eyes. They were blue. Startlingly blue. "Water," he rasped. Maggie gave him a spoonful. He swallowed with difficulty. "You're in my barn," she said. "I figured." "You're hurt. I stitched you up. Don't move too much." "Didn't plan to." He looked around, his expression unreadable. "What's your name?" she asked. He hesitated. "Thomas." "You got a last name?" "Not one I care to use." She waited. He didn't offer more. That night he slept fitfully. By the next morning he was strong enough to sit up. Maggie brought him broth. Ellie watched him from the door, arms folded. "You a criminal?" she asked. "No," Thomas said. "Not anymore." Caleb climbed onto the fence post. "Are you going to die?" "Not today, kid." "Good," Caleb said, satisfied. "Mama don't like burying folks." Maggie flushed. "Caleb?" Thomas chuckled, then winced. He's got a point. Days turned into a week. Thomas gained strength. He started feeding the goats, checking the chicken wire. He fixed the door that had come loose during the storm, said it was the least he could do. He never spoke of how he got hurt. Maggie didn't press, but sometimes, at night, she heard him talking in his sleep. Names, places, apologies whispered to the dark. He started teaching Caleb how to throw a lasso, Ellie how to braid rope tight enough to lead a horse. He took his meals at the kitchen table. He sat near the fire with the children at night. He carved a whistle for Caleb, a hairpin for Ellie. He mended the broken porch rail without being asked. Then one day, Maggie found him splitting wood behind the house. She watched him from the window, the way he moved, the way the children hovered near him, laughing, the way her heart beat faster when he looked up and smiled. He wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was something more. She just didn't know what yet. Maggie didn't sleep much that night. The wind had died down, the air outside still as glass, but her thoughts churned like a storm. She lay in bed, eyes open, listening to the soft creaks of the house settling, the distant rustle of leaves. Somewhere down the hall, Ellie sighed in her sleep. Caleb shifted, the old iron bed frame groaning beneath him. She thought of Thomas, the way he'd taken to the chores without being asked, how he never expected thanks, how he moved like a man who had nothing and wanted even less, except maybe peace. He never flinched at hard work, never raised his voice, never looked at her with anything but respect. That part scared her most of all. The next morning, she found him in the barn with his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow, tending to a goat's hoof with such tenderness she had to blink twice. "She had a nail caught," he said without looking up. "Fixed it." "You've done this before." He nodded. "A long time ago." Where? Wyoming. Before the war. Before everything. She stepped closer. The air smelled of straw and soap. He didn't say more, and she didn't push. She simply stood there watching him work, wondering how someone could carry so much sorrow in his silence and still move so gently. Later that day, he offered to ride to town for supplies. Maggie froze. People might ask questions. I'll say I'm working here, helping out, which I am. They'll want more. Let 'em. She studied him for a long time. Then she handed him a list and a small pouch of coins. If anyone gives you trouble, I'll walk away. He did just that. Rode into town on the old mare, came back 3 hours later with flour, salt, new nails for the barn roof, and 2 extra jars of honey because Caleb liked it in his bread. No one followed him. No one asked questions. That night they had stew with fresh biscuits. The children talked over each other. Ellie read aloud from the book. Caleb played with the wooden animals Thomas had carved. Maggie listened, heart tight, watching Thomas as he laughed and passed the salt and thanked Ellie for the reading. She couldn't remember the last time the house had felt so whole. Weeks passed. Thomas rebuilt the south fence. He repaired the kitchen stairs that had threatened to cave. He taught Caleb how to track rabbit prints through the brush. He showed Ellie how to shoot. Maggie saw how the children looked at him, saw the way they ran to meet him at the end of the day, how they listened when he spoke, how they trusted him without hesitation. It scared her sometimes, how quickly they'd let him in, but she couldn't deny the truth. Neither could she deny what bloomed inside her whenever he was near. One night after the children were asleep, she found him on the porch, sharpening his knife by lantern light. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked. He glanced up. Too quiet. They sat in silence for a while. The stars were bright above, the kind that made you feel both small and blessed. "Why here?" she asked finally. "Why my barn?" "I didn't know it was yours," he said. "I just knew I was dying and needed to get off the road." "But you said my name." He didn't answer right away. "Somebody told me once about a woman out here with 2 kids and a backbone strong enough to hold up the sky." She turned to him. "Who?" "Man I served with. Had family near here. Said if I ever needed shelter, you were the kind who wouldn't ask too many questions." "That sounds like a warning." "Maybe. But I saw the light in your window, and it felt like home." She swallowed hard. "I ain't proud of everything I've done," he said. "But I know what it means to stand for something, and I see what you stand for." "What's that?" "Your kids, this land, every broken thing you've patched with your own 2 hands." Maggie's throat tightened. "I don't expect nothing," he added. "Just glad to earn my keep." "You've earned more than that," she said softly. He looked at her then, really looked. And she saw it in his eyes. Hope. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that grows between one breath and the next. By summer, Thomas had become part of their daily life like he'd always belonged. The town knew him as the hired hand. No one questioned it. He was polite, hard-working, kept to himself. But at home, he was more. He was the man who sat with Caleb during storms, whispering stories until the boy fell asleep. He was the man who taught Ellie how to change the axle on the wagon, and held her hand the first time she broke down, crying over her father. He was the man who touched Maggie's elbow when he passed, just enough to steady her, never more than she gave. Then one day Caleb came in from the field, covered in dust and sweat, and announced that someone had been watching the house from the hill. Thomas stood slowly, face hardening. "You sure?" he asked. Caleb nodded. Thomas strapped on the pistol he hadn't worn in weeks and rode out alone. He didn't return until sundown. When he did, he was bleeding again, just a nick along the shoulder, nothing serious, but Maggie's hands shook as she stitched it closed. "Who was it?" she asked. "Someone looking for me," he said. "They won't be back." "How do you know?" "Because I told them what would happen if they were." He didn't elaborate. She didn't press. But that night she sat with him by the fire, her hand resting on his. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. and when she leaned her head against his shoulder, he breathed in deep and whispered, "Home." From that moment on, something shifted. Thomas didn't sleep in the barn anymore. He didn't sit at the edge of their lives. He was in it, fully. Every morning he kissed the children's foreheads. Every night he told them he was proud of them. He built Ellie a bookcase for her birthday, hand-carved with ivy leaves. He gave Caleb a slingshot and taught him how to aim. He took Maggie's hand in his and held it like a vow. Fall came. The crops were good. The livestock thrived. Maggie found herself humming again while she kneaded bread. And one evening, as the first frost dusted the ground, Thomas brought in a small box. Inside was a ring, simple, gold, worn. "It was my mother's," he said. "I ain't got much to offer, but I've got my word, and my heart, and these hands." Maggie stared at him, tears gathering. "I never asked for a hero," she whispered. "I'm no hero, but you are theirs." He knelt on one knee. She nodded. The children burst from the kitchen, laughing and shouting, and wrapped their arms around him. He wasn't a stranger anymore. He was theirs. He was home. Forever. Winter settled over the farm like a thick quilt, quiet and heavy. Snow came early that year, frosting the trees and burying the fence lines. Maggie kept the stove burning hot and the pantry full. The children helped without being asked, splitting wood, checking the animals, pulling their weight the way Thomas had taught them. He rose before the sun each morning, kissed Maggie's temple, pulled on his boots, and stepped into the cold like it owed him nothing. Caleb followed him most days, his little legs working twice as hard to match Thomas's long stride. Ellie took to carrying her sketch pad in her coat pocket, stopping to draw trees weighted with snow, or the way the horse's breath curled in the cold air. One morning, Maggie stood at the window and watched Thomas help Caleb patch a hole in the chicken coop. Caleb's mittens kept slipping, and Thomas tied them to his wrists with twine. When the boy got frustrated and threw down the hammer, Thomas knelt in the snow beside him and spoke gently, firmly, until Caleb picked it up again. Maggie pressed her hand to the window pane, feeling something bloom in her chest. It was more than love. It was safety, the kind that runs deeper than words. That night they sat close by the fire, Thomas's arm draped over the back of Maggie's chair, Ellie curled up with a book, Caleb on the floor carving a stick into something he claimed was a sword. Thomas looked around the room and smiled, not the small, cautious smile he used when he was holding back, but a full one, easy, open. "Never thought I'd have this," he said. "You do," Maggie replied. "We do." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded piece of paper. Maggie took it from him and unfolded it slowly. It was his discharge, official, signed and stamped. "You're free," she whispered. "I was free the moment you let me stay," he said. "This just makes it legal." She tucked the paper into the family Bible. The next morning, the sun came out, brilliant on the snow. Thomas saddled the mare and rode into town with Ellie and Caleb bundled on either side of him. They returned with bolts of fabric, fresh nails, jars of molasses, and a pair of shoes for Maggie that fit so perfectly she cried. He built her a rocking chair by the fire and carved her name into the back. He built the children a sled from oak and waxed the runners with beeswax until it flew down the hill behind the barn like a bird on ice. He built himself a bed in Maggie's room and never slept alone again. By spring, the land thawed and the rivers swelled. The animals gave birth in the soft straw, and Maggie found herself laughing again. Deep, belly-full laughs that left her breathless and leaning against the barn wall. Thomas never stopped working, never stopped teaching, never stopped loving them. And one night, long after the moon had risen and the house was still, he lay beside Maggie, her head on his chest, and whispered, "I was meant to die in that barn." "You were meant to live," she said. He kissed her forehead. "I just didn't know it until you found me." The years rolled on. Caleb grew tall and lean, steady and smart with a knack for machines. He rebuilt the windmill when no one else could figure it out. He took over the fields the year Thomas sprained his knee and ran them better than any man twice his age. Ellie became a teacher, riding into town each morning on the gray mare Thomas had broken for her. She kept her sketch pad close and mailed drawings to Maggie every month. And Maggie? She woke every morning beside the man she loved, drank coffee on the porch, and held his hand as they watched the sun rise over the land they'd built together. She never forgot the storm, never forgot the man bleeding in her barn, never forgot the moment she opened her heart and let him stay. Because he hadn't just become the father her children needed, he had become her home, forever. The day Thomas planted the new apple orchard, Maggie stood barefoot in the grass, the hem of her dress brushing the clover. He handed her the first sapling himself, roots wrapped in burlap, and together they dug the hole. Caleb worked beside them without complaint, his hands rougher now, more like a man's than a boy's. Ellie brought buckets of water, her braid swinging behind her, a pencil tucked behind one ear like always. They worked until dusk, planting 10 trees in a neat row near the edge of the field where the sun kissed the earth longest. Maggie watched Thomas press the soil firm around the last trunk, and when he looked up, there was something quiet and deep in his expression. "These trees'll outlive us all," he said. She didn't speak, just reached for his hand and held it. At dinner that night, they sat around the table, hands joined, steam rising from the stew pot, candlelight flickering against the window glass. Caleb bowed his head, offering thanks the way Thomas had taught him, soft and sure. "Thank you for this food, for the trees, for our home, for Papa." Thomas's breath caught, and when Maggie glanced at him, she saw the tears in his eyes, not from sadness, from fullness. He reached across the table, resting his calloused hand over Caleb's. "Thank you, son." The word hung in the air like a benediction. In the weeks that followed, the orchard grew roots. Maggie watched it from the kitchen window, morning after morning, her hands in dough or soap or soil. It became a symbol of beginnings, of seasons, of things that took time but were worth the wait. Thomas started writing letters to his sister back in Wyoming, a woman he hadn't spoken to in years. She wrote back, surprised, overjoyed. She promised to visit when the roads dried and the river crossing was safe. Ellie sent sketches to a publication out east and had one printed in the children's magazine. Caleb carved a wooden apple tree for Maggie's birthday, each leaf shaped like a heart. He stained it himself, the grain shining under the oil. That spring, Maggie found a lump behind her ear. She didn't tell anyone at first, not because she was afraid, but because the days were too beautiful to waste on worry. When she finally sat Thomas down on the porch and took his hand, he listened without interrupting. "I don't know what it means yet," she said, "but I'll find out." He held her hand tighter. "Whatever comes, we face it together." The doctor in town ran his tests and gave her good news. It was nothing. A swollen gland, likely from a winter infection she didn't notice at the time. They rode home together in the wagon, laughing like they hadn't in weeks. "I told you I'm not done with you," she said. Thomas grinned. "That's good, because I'm not finished loving you." That summer, the first apples came in, small and tart, but perfect. They harvested them together, baskets piled high, and baked the first pie by lantern light. Maggie rolled the dough. Ellie sliced the fruit. Caleb set the table. Thomas carved initials into the crust, M+T, and baked it until golden. They ate it with cream and laughter, the fire crackling beside them, the sound of crickets rising through the open windows. Later that night, long after the children were in bed, Maggie lay curled against Thomas in the dark. "You never told me what you wanted most," she said. "Back then, before." He was quiet for a long time. "A place to belong," he said finally. "Not just to live, but to matter." She kissed his shoulder. "You do." And he did. When fall came again, the trees turned gold and scarlet. The barn roof needed patching. The fence posts had to be reset. But there was no urgency, no fear, only rhythm. The kind that came from years of work, of trust, of building something together that no wind or storm could undo. On the first day of snow, Thomas surprised her with a new bench by the orchard. He'd carved it from old cedar beams, smooth and strong, with their names etched into the side and the children's initials along the top rail. They sat there together, wrapped in a blanket, watching the snow fall on the apple trees. "We did good," Maggie whispered. "We did," he said, and when he kissed her, it was slow and certain and full of every unspoken promise they'd kept. Because what had begun as a moment of mercy in a cold barn had become a lifetime, a family, a forever kind of love. Maggie leaned her head on his shoulder and closed her eyes. She didn't need to see the orchard to know it was still growing. She could feel it, rooted deep, like them, tools. When spring returned again, it brought more than rain. It brought letters from Ellie, now living in a boarding house in town during the school week, where she taught arithmetic and reading to children half her age. Her notes were filled with sketches and stories, the pages smelling faintly of charcoal and lavender. She wrote about her students, the quiet ones who reminded her of Caleb, the stubborn ones who reminded her of herself. She came home every weekend, riding the gray mare down the dusty lane, her satchel bouncing against her hip, arms open for hugs before she even dismounted. Caleb worked the land with Thomas now, a quiet partnership forged by years of shared tools and sweat. He could read weather better than most, knew how to repair harnesses with a glance, could spot a sick animal before it showed symptoms. Maggie watched them one morning from the kitchen, standing shoulder to shoulder at the fence line, their profiles nearly identical against the morning sky. She didn't say a word, just turned back to the bread dough, her chest full of something deeper than joy. Thomas still rose before dawn. He still kissed her neck while she stirred the fire, still washed his hands before every meal, still carried the scar on his side from the night he stumbled into their barn. But he also carried other things now, letters from Ellie, stories from Caleb, a locket Maggie had given him last Christmas with a curl of her hair and a scrap of one of Ellie's old drawings tucked inside. He had a life, a full one, and he never took a breath of it for granted. They didn't talk much about the past anymore. The children knew enough to understand that their papa had once been a man who ran from things, that he found them when he wasn't looking, that he chose them long before he knew what it meant to stay. But one night, after the children had gone to bed and the rain tapped gently against the windows, Thomas sat with Maggie by the hearth and pulled out a faded envelope. "I never showed you this," he said, handing it over. It was a letter, old, torn at the edges, addressed in a shaky hand. She unfolded it carefully. "My boy, if you're reading this, it means you lived through it, whatever it was. I always knew you'd come back to yourself someday, just didn't know how far you'd have to go to find home again. When you do, stay. Roots matter. Love matters. You matter. Ma." Maggie read it twice, then folded it again and placed it back in the envelope. "She was right," she said. Thomas nodded. "I think she knew it before I did." The next morning he nailed the letter to the inside of the barn door, beneath the beam where he'd once slumped, half dead and broken. He didn't say why, but Maggie understood. It belonged there, a reminder of how far he'd come. The orchard bloomed early that year. White petals rained down every time the wind passed through, scattering like blessings across the fields. Ellie sketched them every afternoon, filling her notebook with page after page of trees and laughter and sunlight. Caleb built a new chicken coop stronger than the last, with a weather vane on top that he carved himself. On Sundays, he played the old guitar Thomas had restrung for him, strumming soft tunes while Maggie sang in the kitchen. They had neighbors now, people who came for help or advice, or just to sit on the porch and drink sweet tea while the sun sank low. Maggie never turned anyone away. Neither did Thomas. Their story had become something shared, something known, not in the way of gossip, but in the way of legend. The man who came wounded and stayed whole. The woman who opened her door and found her life changed forever. The children who chose to love again. That summer, they hosted a picnic beneath the orchard. Tables full of food, quilts spread across the grass, neighbors laughing, children running with sticky hands and bare feet. Thomas sat in his rocking chair, Ellie beside him, Caleb tossing a ball to the younger kids. Maggie watched from the porch, apron dusted with flour, her heart too big for her chest. He caught her eye. She nodded, and he smiled. That night, after the lanterns were blown out and the house lay quiet, they lay tangled together beneath a quilt Ellie had made last Christmas. Maggie traced the line of Thomas's jaw, the curve of his shoulder, the scar near his collarbone. "You saved us," she whispered. "No," he murmured. "You saved me. I just stayed." And stay he did, through every season, through every storm, through every sunrise that followed the long night. Because some men find love, others are saved by it. And Thomas Lane, husband, father, protector, was all three. The first time Thomas held Maggie's hand in public was at the fall harvest fair. She was setting pies on the contest table, her hair pulled back with a red ribbon Ellie had insisted she wear. Her hands were dusted with flour, and her cheeks were pink from the wind. Thomas had just helped Caleb load the last of the apples onto the wagon when he walked over and gently took her hand in his. She looked at him, surprised, but said nothing. They stood like that for a long moment, surrounded by laughter, music, the scent of hay and cider, and when he finally let go, he left his warmth in her palm. Later, after they'd walked the rows of pumpkins and quilts, listened to Ellie play her fiddle on the makeshift stage, and cheered as Caleb won second place in the youth carpentry competition, Thomas found a quiet bench near the edge of the fairgrounds. He sat beside Maggie, her shoulder against his, and watched the lanterns sway in the dusk. "You ever think it'd turn out like this?" he asked. "No," she said, but I prayed for something like it." "I never prayed for anything," he admitted. "Not before you. I didn't think I deserved answers." "You still think that?" He shook his head slowly. "No, not anymore." She rested her head against his arm. "Good." They didn't go home until the fairgrounds were nearly empty. Caleb dozed in the wagon bed, arms around a sack of cornmeal. Ellie rode beside them, humming softly. The moon lit their path all the way back to Morning Ridge. When they reached the house, Thomas carried Caleb inside while Maggie stirred up the fire. Ellie unpacked the leftover pie, placing it on the windowsill to cool. Everything felt simple, solid, whole. The next morning, the first frost sparkled across the fields. Thomas rose early, kissed Maggie's cheek, and slipped into the barn to check the animals. She joined him there, a blanket around her shoulders, coffee in hand. They leaned against the stall together, watching the horses nuzzle for hay. "I was thinking," she said. "Dangerous," he teased. She nudged him gently. "About Ellie, and Caleb, and you." He turned to face her. "You've been their father in every way that counts," she said. "But I want to make it right." "What do you mean?" "I want to change their names. Make it legal, if you want that." He blinked hard, his voice low when he spoke. "Are you sure?" "They already call you Papa. They already look to you for everything. You're their father, Thomas. We just need the papers to catch up." He pulled her into his arms. "Yes," he whispered. "Yes, I want that." They made the trip to the courthouse the following week. The judge remembered Maggie from her debt hearings years before. He barely recognized her now, head held high, a man at her side, children flanking them like sentinels. The adoption was granted without delay. Outside, Ellie handed Thomas a folded slip of paper. It was her newest drawing, 2 hands holding a sapling, its roots deep and wild. Above it she'd written one word, "Ours." Thomas framed it and hung it above the hearth. That winter, snow fell early and often. The roads closed. The wind howled for days. But inside the house, there was music, warmth, and the low murmur of love spoken without effort. Caleb sat at Thomas's feet, learning to whittle. Ellie read aloud every evening, her voice strong and clear. Maggie worked on a new quilt made from scraps of their old life, stitched into something beautiful and warm. One night, as the fire burned low and the children slept upstairs, Thomas took Maggie's hand. "I've been thinking," he said. "Dangerous," she whispered, smiling. He ignored the tease. "I want to build a new room, bigger, for guests, for when Ellie has children of her own, for when Caleb brings someone home." Maggie's breath caught. "You think about those things?" "All the time." He kissed her knuckles. "I want this house to be full, Maggie. Full of life, of laughter, of people who know they're safe here." She kissed him softly. "Then we'll build it." By spring, the new room stood tall and bright, with wide windows and a floor Caleb had sanded by hand. They furnished it together, every piece chosen with care. And when Maggie stood in the doorway, arms crossed, surveying the space, Thomas wrapped his arms around her waist and rested his chin on her shoulder. "What do you think?" he asked. "I think we've made something that will last." They named it the Hope Room, not after their daughter, but for what they'd found when they least expected it. A second chance, a family, a forever. The garden behind the house exploded with color that spring, brighter than any year before. Maggie had planted more morning glories, their vines curling up the trellises Thomas had built from cedar. Ellie's flowers lined the edges, wild daisies, blue flax, golden coreopsis, and bees buzzed lazily from bloom to bloom. It smelled like new beginnings, like promises that had been kept. Thomas spent his mornings tending the orchard. The apples were coming in strong now, thanks to the careful pruning he and Caleb had done the season before. He kept a ledger in the barn with rows of notes, dates, measurements, rainfall, plans. Caleb had added his own column beside it, carefully tracking the soil pH and adjusting fertilizer. Their writing stood side by side, a father and son in ink. Ellie returned home for the summer, arms full of books and sketches. She brought stories from her students and began drafting something of her own, pages of lined paper tucked into a leather folder, the first signs of a novel about a girl who lived on a farm and the stranger who taught her family how to love again. Thomas read her early pages by lantern light, his thumb pressing gently into the margin. When he finished, he looked at Ellie and said, "You have your mother's voice." Ellie smiled and hugged him tighter than she had in years. One evening, just before the solstice, they gathered on the porch for supper. The sky was gold, and the air was warm. Caleb brought out the bread. Ellie poured the lemonade. Maggie lit the oil lamp, its flame flickering in the breeze. Thomas raised his glass. "To Roots," he said. They all clinked their glasses together. Later, when the stars had come out and the children had gone to bed, Maggie and Thomas sat in the porch swing. Fireflies blinked in the field, and the sound of frogs echoed from the pond. "I never thought I'd see this," he said, "a life this quiet." "You earned it." He looked at her, his face softer in the moonlight. "No, you gave it to me." They rocked in silence for a while. The wind carried the scent of lilacs from the bush Ellie had planted. Somewhere inside, the floorboards creaked as the house settled. "I want to be buried here," Thomas said quietly, "on the hill, near the orchard." Maggie didn't flinch. "Me too." They clasped hands, fingers intertwined. "When that time comes," she said, "we'll go together." He kissed the back of her hand. "Not yet." "No," she agreed, "not yet." That summer stretched on like a dream. They hosted neighbors for barn dances and church socials. Maggie's pie won a blue ribbon at the fair. Caleb took first prize for his carved cedar horse. Ellie's short story was published in a regional magazine. Thomas built a treehouse for the neighbors' twins, repaired the schoolhouse porch, helped old Mr. Hathaway dig a new well. He never asked for payment, never expected thanks. He just smiled and said, "We all get lost. Sometimes we need a place to land." People began to say the Lane farm was where you went if you needed help, a meal, a place to sleep, a kind word, a reminder that good still lived in the world. Thomas never let it change him. He still woke before dawn, still kissed Maggie's cheek before coffee, still walked the fence line with his eyes scanning the horizon. One night he returned later than usual. Maggie met him at the gate, her lantern held high. "You okay?" He nodded. "Just thinking." "About what?" He looked up at the stars. "About that first night. About how close I was to giving up. If I'd fallen a mile earlier, or later." "You didn't." "No," he said, voice thick. "Because you opened the door." She reached for him and pulled him close. "I didn't save you," she whispered. "You did more than that," he said. "You gave me something to live for." The next morning, he planted a new tree at the edge of the orchard, a peach tree this time, its roots strong and its limbs already reaching. He carved a small plaque and staked it at the base. "For what we've built." Years later, when gray streaked his hair and Maggie walked slower, they still sat on the porch each night, the swing creaking beneath their weight, their fingers laced together. The orchard stretched before them. The house stood tall and warm. Their children, grown now, still returned for every holiday, every harvest, every moment that mattered. Thomas would glance at Maggie and smile, "Still here," and she would nod, always. When the first grandchild was born, Maggie cried so hard she couldn't speak. Ellie, tired and radiant, held the baby close against her chest while Caleb hovered nervously near the door of the birthing room, his hands jammed into his pockets. Thomas had built the cradle months before, oak and hickory, inlaid with vines and stars. He'd carved each detail at night, by firelight, whittling away the hours with care and patience. He placed it beside the bed now, smoothing the blanket with shaking hands. "He has your eyes," Ellie whispered to her mother. Maggie leaned down, brushing a thumb across her grandson's cheek. "He has your spirit." Thomas stood in the doorway, silent. He didn't move until Caleb stepped aside and gently nudged him forward. Then he crossed the room slowly and looked down at the baby. The child stared back at him, wide-eyed and blinking, so small and new. Thomas reached out, his fingers brushing the baby's tiny hand. "Hello, little one," he murmured. "I've waited my whole life for you." They named him Samuel Thomas. That night, after the baby was asleep and the house had quieted, Maggie found Thomas in the orchard. He stood beneath the peach tree he'd planted years before, one hand resting on the trunk. She joined him there, sliding her arm through his. "I'm a grandfather," he said. "You've always been a father." He nodded, eyes damp. "But this feels like a promise kept." They stayed there a long time, listening to the breeze in the branches, the hush of the grass, the soft, far-off rustle of the house behind them. The stars blinked overhead, and the night wrapped around them like a blanket. In the weeks that followed, the farm came alive with visitors, friends, neighbors, cousins, all wanting to see the new baby, to offer gifts and stories and songs. The porch filled with rocking chairs. The table held more food than it could bear. Maggie moved from kitchen to crib to garden, her heart fuller than she ever thought possible. Thomas spent his mornings with Samuel, walking the edges of the orchard with the baby in his arms, whispering stories into the warm Kansas wind. "He was born under a good sky," he told Maggie once, as they watched the sunrise. "You can tell. It's in his bones." They planted a new tree that year, a cherry sapling beside the peach, its leaves a deep, glossy green. Caleb helped dig the hole. Ellie held the baby while Thomas lowered the roots into the earth. Maggie poured the water, her hand steady, her smile soft. "What'll we call it?" Caleb asked. Thomas looked around at the family standing beside him. His family. His home. "Grace," he said. "Let's call it Grace." Summer faded. The harvest came early. Apples by the bushel, tomatoes in jars, beans drying in the sun. Ellie and her husband returned to town with the baby, promising to come back every weekend. Caleb stayed close, taking more and more of the work from Thomas's shoulders, until Thomas finally handed him the old ledger with a quiet nod. "It's yours now." "You're not going anywhere," Caleb said. "No," Thomas agreed, "but it is still time." That night, Maggie and Thomas danced in the kitchen. The fire burned low. A fiddle tune played softly from the corner radio. He took her hand, slow and unsteady, and they moved together across the worn floorboards like they had 100 times before. "You remember the first time you kissed me?" she asked. "I remember thinking you might slap me." She laughed, leaning into him. "I almost did." He kissed her again, slow and sure. Outside, the orchard swayed in the wind. The seasons turned, as they always did, but the house remained full, warm, alive. The porch swing creaked under generations of stories. The kitchen table bore the weight of years. The barn stood tall, the orchard wide, the garden lush with color, and in the center of it all stood Maggie and Thomas. Two people who had once been strangers, now bound by something deeper than luck, deeper than chance, love that had been earned, chosen, kept forever. The day Maggie fell ill, the house turned quiet in a way it hadn't in decades. It wasn't a storm or a sudden fall or some dramatic gasp in the night. It was a cough that lingered too long, a weariness that didn't lift. Thomas noticed first the way her steps slowed when she crossed the porch, how she sat longer at the breakfast table, staring out the window with her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. "You all right?" he asked her one morning, kneeling to tie her boot for her like he always did. "I'm just tired," she replied, brushing his hair back. "It's nothing." But it wasn't nothing. The doctor came. He was kind, gentle in that way people are when they already know the news is bad. Ellie and Caleb stood on either side of the bed while the baby played on the rug near Thomas's feet. The doctor used words like time and comfort and rest. He said it softly, carefully, but every word felt like thunder. After he left, Thomas sat beside Maggie and took her hand. "How long have you known?" She turned her face toward him, her skin pale but warm. "A while." "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because we had apples to pick," she said, "and Ellie's book to celebrate, and Caleb's colt to train, and Samuel's second birthday, because I didn't want the end to start too soon." He leaned his head against her shoulder, tears thick in his throat. "You're not allowed to go before me." "Someone has to tell our story properly," she said, "and we both know you're too stubborn for poetry." He chuckled wetly, and she reached up to wipe his face with the edge of her sleeve. "Don't cry yet," she whispered. "There's still time." And there was. They made the most of it. Every morning, Thomas brewed the coffee and carried it to her bedside. Every afternoon, they sat in the porch swing, wrapped in a blanket, her head on his shoulder. Ellie moved back home, bringing Samuel and her husband. Caleb took over the farm entirely, his hands confident, his back strong. Neighbors came with casseroles, pies, jars of preserves. Letters arrived from people who had once passed through the Lane home in some hour of need, now writing to say thank you, that they remembered, that they hadn't forgotten. Maggie read every single one. Some nights she was too tired to speak, so Thomas read aloud from her old journal, the one where she'd first written about the wounded man in the barn, the cold winter, the second chance neither of them saw coming. "You've written our whole life," he told her. "It's all here." "Not all of it," she said softly. "Not the best parts, those were just lived." The night she passed, the stars were bright, and the peach tree was beginning to bloom again. She slipped away in her sleep, her hand in Thomas's, her breath soft and even until it stopped. She was gone by the time the birds began to sing. Thomas didn't cry right away. He sat beside her, stroking her hand, whispering the names of every place they had touched, every child they had raised, every year they had earned. Caleb and Ellie came in quietly, one sitting on each side. Samuel climbed into his mother's lap, not fully understanding, but knowing somehow to be still. They buried her under the tree marked Grace. The stone was simple. Maggie Lane, beloved mother, wife, and home. You were the light we followed. In the weeks that followed, the world kept moving. The sun still rose. The orchard still bloomed. Caleb kept the fences strong. Ellie kept writing. Samuel kept laughing. And Thomas kept the swing warm every night. He talked to her, told her about the weather, about Caleb's new filly, about Ellie's next manuscript, about the pie he tried to make and burned, and some nights, when the wind was just right, he could swear he heard her laugh on the breeze. Years passed. The children grew older. The orchard bore more fruit. The house saw new faces, new hands, new joy. But at the heart of it all, Thomas Lane remained, leaning on the porch post, watching the sunset, the journal in his lap, the memory of Maggie in every corner of his chest. He lived to see Samuel grow tall, to hold his first great-grandchild, to rebuild the barn after a lightning strike and plant another tree in the spot where she once stood barefoot in the grass. And when he finally laid down one night, the journal resting beside him, the last page written in his steady hand, he dreamed of morning glories, and her, smiling, waiting, ready to walk home together forever. They buried Thomas beside Maggie, just as he'd asked, under the peach tree, the one they'd planted together, the one that had grown strong and wide, its roots deep in the same earth where they had once built a life out of nothing but grit, grace, and love. It was spring again. The orchard was in bloom. White petals drifted like snow through the air, catching on the wind and falling soft onto the fresh-turned soil. The family stood in a wide circle, Caleb with his hands clasped tight, Ellie holding her son, now a boy of 10, his cheeks damp with silent tears. Neighbors came too, old friends, people who had worked with Thomas, eaten at Maggie's table, slept under their roof when they had nowhere else to go. No one spoke for a long time. Then Ellie stepped forward, her voice clear and steady as she read from the journal he had left behind. "She saved my life," she read, "but that wasn't the miracle. The miracle was that she let me stay, that she handed me her children, her trust, her heart, and I did my best to deserve them." Caleb took a shaky breath and stepped up beside his sister. "He did more than that," he said. "He became the kind of man I want to be, the kind of father I hope I've been, the kind of legacy I'll spend my whole life trying to honor." They placed the journal in a cedar box between the two graves, wrapped in the quilt Maggie had stitched with her own hands, the one that held pieces of their life in every patch. The children laid apple blossoms on the graves. Samuel carved a new bench for the hill just behind where they lay, with one word burned into the wood: home. Seasons passed. The orchard thrived. The house never emptied. The porch swing still swayed in the breeze, even when no one sat in it. Caleb and Ellie kept the land. Samuel became a teacher. And though new hands held the reins and new voices echoed through the kitchen, nothing truly changed. Because love had built this place. And love, when planted deep enough, never dies. Every year, on the day of the peach tree's first bloom, the family gathered on the hill. They brought baskets and stories, laughter and silence. They sat on the bench, under the branches that now arched high above the graves, and remembered the woman who had opened her barn to a stranger, and the man who had stayed to become everything she and her children had needed. Their names, carved in stone and carried in hearts, lived on in every blossom, every harvest, every sunrise over the Kansas fields. And the story of Maggie and Thomas Lane was passed down not just as history, but as truth. That even the most broken soul can heal, that even the hardest winters end, that sometimes family is not born, but chosen, and that love, once planted, blooms forever. Years later, a child stood in the orchard with a book in her hands and a pencil behind her ear. Her name was Lily, Samuel's granddaughter, and she was 9, with bright eyes and her mother's curiosity. She had never met Thomas or Maggie, but she knew their stories like scripture. She knew how her great-grandmother had taken in a wounded man and fed him stew when they barely had enough for 3. She knew how her great-grandfather had fixed the barn roof and stitched their family back together with wood and wire and words that mattered. She sat cross-legged beneath the peach tree and opened her notebook. She could see the 2 gravestones from where she sat, simple, close, softened by time. The breeze tugged gently at the corner of her page as she began to write. They weren't rich, she wrote. They weren't famous. But they built something stronger than either, something you could feel in the floorboards and smell in the bread, and hear in the way people laughed when they walked through the front gate. They made a life, a good one, and they passed it down like heirlooms. The words came easy. She wrote about the orchard, the house with the red door, the porch swing that never stopped swaying. She wrote about her grandfather's stories, her mother's lullabies, her Uncle Caleb's strong hands and gentle heart. She wrote about the bench under the tree and how everyone who sat on it said they could still feel Maggie's warmth and Thomas's steady hand in the wind. By the time the sun dipped behind the hills, she had filled 3 pages. She closed the notebook and tucked it under her arm. The blossoms fell around her in soft flurries as she walked back to the house. Inside, the table was already set. Laughter spilled from the kitchen, her father's voice, her grandmother's, the clatter of silverware, the scent of roasted chicken and sweet apples. Home. It was different now. Brighter, louder, busier. But at its heart it was still theirs, still rooted in the choice one woman had made to open her door, still shaped by the man who had walked through it, broken and bleeding, and stayed. Still alive with the love they had planted. Lily paused on the threshold, her hand on the doorframe, her fingers brushing over the names carved there in careful script. Maggie, Thomas. She whispered them softly, like a promise. Then she stepped inside and closed the door behind her. Spring returned once again to the orchard, quiet and slow, the earth waking without hurry. The peach blossoms came first, just like always, pale pink and white against the deepening blue of the Kansas sky. Then the apples, then the cherries. Bees danced between the blooms. The fields turned soft and green, and the porch swing creaked softly on the breeze. Lily stood beneath the peach tree with her newest journal pressed to her chest, the leather worn soft from use. She was 15 now, taller, stronger. But she still came to the hill every week, still sat on the bench carved with the word home, still listened for stories in the wind. She read the old letters sometimes, Maggie's journal, Thomas's notes, Caleb's ledgers. Ellie had kept them all in a cedar chest, tucked away in the attic under quilts and old photographs. When Lily had found them 2 summers ago, she'd read every word by candlelight. She already knew the story. But now she knew their voices, Thomas's steady lines, Maggie's quiet strength. She traced their words with her fingers and wept more than once. Today she opened her own journal and turned to a fresh page. They never meant to become legends, she wrote. They were just trying to survive. But in doing so, with kindness and courage and open hearts, they gave the rest of us a way to live. Down at the house, her family was gathering. Her father had made cider. Her mother was roasting chickens. Ellie, now gray-haired and soft-spoken, had arrived that morning with fresh rolls and a new stack of letters. Caleb came last, limping slightly now, but still carrying tools on his belt. His son walked beside him, and his grandson, barely 6, clutched a bouquet of morning glories in one hand and a slice of pie in the other. Lily stayed a little longer on the hill, the journal open in her lap. She could hear the laughter drifting up the slope. She closed her eyes and listened. Maggie's voice, Thomas's, still there somehow in the wind and the earth and the old wood of the porch swing. When she finally stood, she pressed her palm to the tree trunk. "Thank you," she whispered, "for choosing to stay." She walked down the hill, the journal tucked close, her steps quiet and sure. Back home, the lights glowed warm behind the windows. The house still stood. The orchard still bloomed, and the story, rooted deep in that first act of mercy, lived on in every branch, every laugh, every child born into the legacy of love they had built forever. When Lily turned 18, she asked to be baptized under the peach tree, the same tree that had shaded her mother's first kiss, that had heard her grandfather's last prayer, that had held 1,000 whispers in the breeze between its boughs. It wasn't the usual place for such things, but everyone agreed it was right. The morning was warm, the sky streaked with silver clouds, and the family gathered early. Ellie wore her best hat. Caleb brought a folding chair for his knee. Children ran barefoot through the orchard rows, their laughter mixing with the low hum of bees. Lily stood barefoot in a white dress, her hair braided with apple blossoms. She said her vows with her hand on the tree's bark, and when the water touched her forehead, she looked up, her eyes full of tears and light. That night they lit lanterns in the orchard and danced to fiddle music until the candles burned low. The table was set with every kind of pie, apple, cherry, peach, and all the favorites from generations past. Someone read aloud from Maggie's journal. Someone else passed around a photograph of Thomas holding baby Samuel, his eyes crinkled with a joy too big for words. Lily sat beside the bench with her youngest cousin asleep in her lap. She listened to the voices she knew so well. She looked up at the stars between the branches and whispered a quiet, "Thank you." The years kept passing. The orchard grew thicker. The house was painted again, though the swing still creaked just the same. Lily became a writer. She published her first book at 21. The title was simple, The Barn. Inside, she told the story as it had been told to her, and as she had come to live it. Of the widow who opened her door, of the man who stayed, of the children who healed, and the family they all became. The book traveled far. Letters came in from places Lily had never seen, from women who had lost husbands, from men who had been alone too long, from children who had never heard of Kansas but now dreamed of morning glories on fence posts and peach trees with names. She answered every letter. With each reply she felt the echo of Maggie in her hand, the steadiness of Thomas in her chest. When Lily married, she wore her great-grandmother's ribbon. When her first child was born, she named her Grace. And when she built her own house, just down the road near the river, she laid the first stone with the journal beside her, open to the last page Maggie had ever written. Love does not always come when we ask, but when it arrives, we choose to keep it. We choose to build with it, to plant it like a seed. And if we are faithful, it blooms forever. When Lily's daughter Grace turned 5, she asked about the 2 stones beneath the peach tree. They were walking through the orchard at dusk, the sky streaked with soft rose and gold, the kind of light that made everything look like memory. Grace pointed at the worn markers with small fingers and a thoughtful tilt of her head. "Are those the people in your stories?" she asked. Lily nodded. "Yes, that's where Maggie and Thomas rest." "Were they real?" "They were more real than almost anyone I've ever known." Grace stepped closer to the tree, touching its rough bark with reverent curiosity. "What did they do?" Lily crouched beside her. "They chose love, even when it was hard, even when it hurt." Grace looked back at the house, its windows glowing with firelight, her father chopping kindling near the porch, the smoke curling from the chimney, the smell of stew wafting through the air. "Is that why we have all this?" "It's exactly why we have all this." Grace didn't say anything else. She reached down, plucked a small wildflower growing near the stone, and tucked it gently at its base. Then she took her mother's hand and walked back toward home. That night, as Lily tucked her daughter into bed, she paused in the doorway and looked back at the small girl already drifting to sleep, the quilt pulled to her chin, the journal Maggie had once stitched, now resting on the shelf above her head. She stepped outside into the night air and followed the path through the orchard alone. The blossoms had long since fallen, but the trees still whispered in the breeze. When she reached the peach tree, she sat on the bench and let the silence wrap around her. "I keep telling the story," she whispered, "just like you asked." The wind stirred. A leaf landed gently in her lap, and for a moment Lily imagined a warm hand on her shoulder, a whisper in her ear, a familiar heartbeat beside her own. The stars above shimmered, the orchard swayed, and the legacy of a wounded stranger and a brave widow, their kindness, their courage, their choice to love, lived on. It always would. Every spring, the peach tree bloomed first. Long before the apple buds swelled or the cherry blossoms opened, the peach tree stood like a promise in the center of the orchard. Its pale flowers catching the earliest light, its roots deep in the same soil that held Maggie and Thomas side by side. Lily returned there every year. She brought her journals, her daughter, her memories. Some years it rained, and she sat beneath an umbrella, writing until her fingers ached. Other years the sun was warm and gentle, and Grace braided flower crowns while her mother read aloud. They didn't need an audience. The trees had become witnesses. The farm never emptied. New generations took over the chores. New children learned to mend fences, to can preserves, to plant seeds with patient hands. The porch swing still creaked. The scent of bread still drifted from the kitchen. The kitchen table was scarred with decades of elbows and laughter, but it was still where decisions were made and stories passed down. Thomas's carvings still lined the mantel. Maggie's quilts still covered every bed. Their journals, carefully bound and protected, were kept in a drawer in the parlor where children were taught to touch them only with clean hands and full hearts. When someone felt lost or scared or needed a reminder of who they were, someone would say, "Go read about the barn." And they would, because the barn was where it began, a wounded man bleeding and alone. A widow, worn but unbending. Children, frightened and watching. A choice, simple and impossible. Help him, let him go, turn him in, turn him away. And Maggie chose the hardest thing. She chose kindness. She chose to carry someone else's burden, even when her own hands were already full. And Thomas, with every ounce of strength he had left, chose to become worthy of that grace. Not immediately, not easily, but entirely. In time, the barn became a cradle for something much larger than survival. It became a home, and now that home stretched far beyond the orchard and the fields and the front porch. It lived in every family that visited and was offered coffee and a bed. It lived in every child who listened wide-eyed to Lily's stories at the county library. It lived in every letter that came from across the world saying, "I thought I was alone. But then I read about Maggie." Lily grew older. Her hands became lined, her voice softer. Grace took over the writing, and one morning Grace walked the orchard alone. She paused at the peach tree, her own daughter nestled in a sling against her chest, and she ran her fingers over the two headstones weathered by wind and time. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. They already knew. She sat on the bench, opened a fresh journal, and began to write. This is the story of a woman who opened her door. This is the story of a man who stayed. This is the story of what love can build, when given the space and the time and the choice. And when the wind picked up and scattered petals across the grass, she kept writing. Because some stories never end. Years later, when Grace's daughter was grown and the orchard was older still, people came from far and wide just to see the bench beneath the peach tree. They came with journals and sketchbooks and questions in their eyes. They came after losses, after beginnings, after long roads with no clear end. They came not for spectacle, but for stillness. The Lane family never advertised. They never asked anyone to come. But the story, Maggie's story, Thomas's story, had grown beyond them, like the roots of the orchard, like the quiet pull of memory that found its way to hearts without needing direction. One day a young man arrived alone. He stood beside the tree for a long time, his coat dusty, his hands trembling. He carried a dog-eared copy of The Barn, the pages stuffed with notes and underlines. He didn't ask to speak to anyone. He just sat, and when he finally stood, he placed a single wildflower at the base of the stone that bore Thomas's name. Then he turned and walked back down the hill, wiping his eyes as the breeze carried the scent of blossoms behind him. Grace watched from the kitchen window. She understood. After he left, she made her way up the hill with slow, deliberate steps. She sat on the bench, her knees aching in the spring chill, and opened her mother's final journal. The pages had grown thin at the edges, filled with loops and swirls of ink, her voice caught forever between the lines. Grace read the last entry aloud to the empty orchard. Love is not a moment, it is not a single act. It is not found, it is made, it is chosen. And when it is chosen again and again, it becomes something that no time or silence or sorrow can take away. It becomes the place you live, the place you leave behind, the place others return to when they forget that kindness can heal, that forgiveness can grow, that even the coldest ground can bloom. Grace closed the journal and rested it on her lap. The trees rustled gently around her. The swing creaked. And down at the house, the next generation was setting the table. Setting more places than the people who currently lived there, just in case. Because Maggie would have, and Thomas would have opened the door. And the story, still unfolding, still rooted, still reaching toward the light, would be waiting. In the heart of summer, when the orchard was thick with fruit and the air shimmered with heat, Grace hosted a gathering beneath the trees. It wasn't for a holiday or a birthday. It was just because the story called for it. People came with blankets and baskets, folding chairs and coolers, elders and babies, widows and new husbands, families with no blood ties but hearts tethered by shared pages. They called it the homecoming. No signs, no speeches, just the sound of laughter under the peach tree, of children running between rows of apple trees, of quiet conversations where people said things they'd held in too long. As the sun dipped low, Grace stood beneath the old peach tree and looked around her. The bench was full, and a dozen more had been built around it since. The air smelled of warm earth and pie. Fireflies blinked in the shadows. She stepped up onto a small wooden crate and waited for the murmurs to still. "I won't keep you long," she said, her voice strong despite her age. "You all know why we're here. You all know who we are." She pointed to the 2 stones nestled in the grass. This place didn't start with a farm, or a tree, or a field. It started with a door, a stranger, a wound, and a woman who chose love instead of fear. She paused. And the man who stayed. A hush settled over the gathering. The cicadas quieted. The breeze held still. "I've spent my life telling this story, and now my daughter writes it better than I ever could. But I want you to hear something tonight, something simple, something true." She held up a worn journal, the leather cover faded, the pages soft with time. "This is my mother's. It's filled with her handwriting, her recipes, her lists, but in the back there's something I never read aloud before, something she wrote in the final days of her life." Grace opened the book. The pages whispered. She wrote, "If anyone finds this place, if anyone stumbles through our orchard, if anyone reaches our porch, if anyone needs rest, food, or quiet, open the door. You never know what story you're welcoming in." She closed the book, and the people gathered there wept, not from sadness, but from the kind of gratitude that sinks deep and never leaves. That night, after the last lanterns had been blown out and the children had been carried to bed, Grace sat alone on the porch, her feet bare, her hands folded. The swing beside her swayed gently, as if someone else sat there too. She smiled. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. They already knew. The story was alive, still walking, still blooming, still being written. When Grace's great-granddaughter, A quiet girl named June, with curious eyes and ink-stained fingers, turned 12. She asked if she could sleep one night in the barn. It was the same barn, though it had been repaired, expanded, painted again and again. Still, it held the bones of the past. The loft where Thomas had once bled. The stall where Maggie had laid him down. The same place where fear met mercy and changed the world. "Why?" Grace asked gently. June shrugged. "I just want to feel it, where it started." Grace nodded. "Then take the old quilt, the one with the morning glories." June climbed the ladder with a lantern, the quilt folded under her arm, a notebook in her bag. She laid the blanket out over hay that smelled of summer and silence. She sat cross-legged, her back against a beam, and listened. The barn creaked in the wind. The horses shifted in their stalls. The owls called to each other from the cottonwoods. She didn't write at first. She just waited. And in the stillness, she felt it. Not a ghost, not a vision, but something living, as if the walls still remembered Maggie's hands, cool and firm, as if the rafters still echoed Thomas's whispered apologies to the dark, as if every beam, every board, carried the weight of the moment when everything had turned, not because someone had power, but because someone had chosen love over fear. She opened her notebook. She wrote one sentence. "This is where we became who we are." She fell asleep with the lantern still glowing and her head on the morning glory quilt. In the morning, she came down the ladder smiling. She didn't tell anyone what she'd felt. But her mother noticed she held herself differently, that she spoke with a steadier voice, that her stories, written in crooked cursive, had more heart than before. That fall, June began collecting the family stories again. She found new ones, tucked in letters, scrawled on the backs of recipes, folded in drawers. She copied them into a thick book, binding it with ribbon and stitching pressed leaves between the pages. She read it aloud the following spring beneath the peach tree, her voice clear and certain as the orchard bloomed around her. The trees listened, the house watched, and somewhere far beyond where eyes could see, Maggie and Thomas smiled. Because the story had not ended. It never would.